Everybody. Thanks for taking your time to come to part one of this webinar series today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Amber and Kevin. If you guys can kick your camera and mics on and get started with the presentation. Thanks,
Boom, like that.
like magic.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I am getting my stuff up here. Hang on. I'll get that infinity look for a moment. Boom. So the way that we're going to run questions is that you can ask them at any time, so they're in context. And then Megan will just pipe up on your behalf and ask the question, and we'll kind of go into it. So first off, welcome everyone and happy Valentine's Day. We did change the schedule a little bit, but I think it actually fits really well to have it on Valentine's Day. When you look at a good stat like this, like 32.7% of people spend more time with their phone than a significant other. So this is an early warning in the day to say, don't be this person that spends more time on their phone with their than with their significant other. I think I had another stat that said 60% of people use their smartphone as their wingman now. So you never know what's going to happen. So, as Megan mentioned, I'm Amber. Hi, everyone. I am the CEO and founder of Paravision. I put together this 3-part series because as I was putting out different blogs or talking to different people on LinkedIn, etc., one of the things that they asked for is they said, could you really share kind of what is your start to finish philosophy when it comes to smartphones? So when I'm starting to design my lab, I know maybe what directions I should be going or not going or what I should be looking at because there's just a lot of information out there and I don't know how to weed through all of it. So I came up with this set of, or the series of 3 about smartphones so that we could look at everything from our acquisition stage to our analytics stage to the last stage, which is really getting into the data presentation and how different people are going to see it, how we might use some modernized tools to be able to improve our investigation and all of that. So hopefully you join us for the entire series. So today I have a colleague with me. I have Kevin Fisher with me. He is going to help me with a portion when we talk about some of the different techniques out there. So I thought that would be a little easier. And I apologize for my poor lighting. I am on the road, so I get to work with what I have. So let's start out with smartphones as our primary data source. We're used to that now that we've had that shift occur where we were really focused on computers for so long. And as we've moved into the mid to late 2000s or the 2010s, etc., they've really become our primary device as far as what people are using. They're getting rid of laptops to be able to have their smartphone as their primary. And so we've had to adjust our labs to be able to make sure that we're prioritizing this particular piece of evidence because when we don't prioritize it, it ends up causing us problems. And so that's one of the first things that you have to make a decision out when you're doing your different lab designs is you have to decide that smartphones are going to be your first priority. Remember, our computers, whether laptop, desktop, etc., they're not really doing the amount of changes that we see with our smart devices because they're always in this constant state of flux. And that constant state of flux makes them one of our highest maintenance forms of evidence. So we have to kind of make adjustments in our lab with that in mind. So when we look at them as our primary data sources, there's 3 different data areas that we have to look at when we consider our smartphone. And I know most people really focus in on that first one, which is that physical device side of it, which is where we're going to talk acquisitions and all the information that comes from the different acquisition techniques. But there are 2 other data sources that are just as valuable to us as that primary acquisition because they add more depth and breadth into what we're looking at as far as our data sources, which is our cloud data sources, because we know we get associated keys in our smart device. And so we want to search out that information as well. And then our last one is our compliance data sources. Oh, I didn't close Teams. So whoops. So as we look at those last sources, our compliance data sources, that's really when we start seeing our privacy law changes influencing what's happening with us with our digital evidence. It's actually been a blessing to us. Most of the time, you would think it is not a blessing, but in this case, it absolutely is because it is producing a new additional main source of evidence for us. So we're going to discuss all 3 of these different areas as part of our acquisition step because this is our data gathering step. So this is our step 1. So let's start out by looking at our physical devices. So I am sure everyone has done this. What tool can forensically acquire a cell phone or a mobile phone or a smartphone? And you've asked Google this question over and over again at different times. You might have asked different Google derivatives this same question, and you might have even asked AI. I cleaned out some of the AI answer to this. And here's part of the problem when you start doing the investigative side of what some of your tools should be when you're looking for them. You're first off going to be hit with piles and piles of marketing. I'm actually very disgruntled with how Google has changed the way the engine actually works, because I have to get through not only an AI answer, but then I have to get through piles and piles of sponsored answers, which means that they've paid money to fall within my search parameter in the first place. And then I usually have to go through a couple other social networks before I actually start finding the real meat and potatoes, so to speak, of what the answer is I'm looking for. So keep that in mind, that in this particular space, because it has become such a primary evidence source for everyone, it's also received more investment dollars. It's also received higher price tags on tools. It's had a lot of shifts that have occurred with it that didn't occur in some of the other spaces because it went viral. It was prolific that every single person has a smartphone out there. So we really have to go through when we're deciding what we want to do in our lab design is kind of pick and choose where our best answers are and then go through and evaluate those. So I'm going to show you that little metrics chart that I do when I'm evaluating different pieces of technology. So let's talk about those device options. So we have a lot of different ways that different tools say what our acquisition choices are with it. So our default one that we've heard for years is, of course, our logical imaging. Logical imaging is our equivalent of taking a book and shaking out all of the text, images, and everything that make what that book is, and we shake it out, and that becomes what our logical image is. So we know any of the content that occurred within that particular book or smartphone. I always use books as my analogy. So even if there were different pieces of information that with a smartphone, let's say I had a book and I wrote a note in the margin or I erased that note in the margin, all of those pieces of information, because they still occurred in logical data storage associated with the phone, our logical image is still going to produce that information. So that's one of the best things when it comes to that, is that we still get recoverable information with logical images, and we still get all of the user-oriented data associated with that device. So that's great. So that's all the data pieces that a lot of our user can touch. So we're going to see those with our logical. You might also hear tools call them enhanced or advanced logical imaging. What that is simply telling you is that you're going to go through an additional step to collect a new data source that has to have either a different handshake done or a different permission control granted to it in order to grant these other areas of data storage that might be valuable to our investigation. Most of the time, a tool should default to having whatever they decide is their enhanced version might be. So I'm going to use the example of an iPhone. iPhone imaging is pretty generic across most of the tools when it comes to a logical or an enhanced logical image, which means that I'm going to see almost the exact same thing that is produced when I work with iTunes itself. The reason is Apple is an extremely structured OS and an extremely structured device. So if you don't color exactly within those lines and work with that exactly in those parameters, it typically starts having failures, or it simply will not allow that access level. So that's why we always have our encrypted backup option as a standard with our logical imaging when it comes to iPhones. And we know that's really just to gain access into some of the unique storage areas, such as our keychain data that we can get with our iPhones. A lot of times people ask me, they say, wait a second, is that still a valid forensic image to just do to that level? And the answer is yes. Your evaluation or your method to be able to capture that image is still forensically sound. You're still doing everything you should within that forensic process. And there's no default forensic image standard out there. I think that's been hyped up with some marketing out there. So if you go back, and we're going to use a US example because I know we're an international group, is if you go back and you look at some of the NIST standards associated with our forensic images really focus in on that logical imaging because it was the first gaugeable forensic environment to make those images. Now, if we were to flip this over, because if we talk about iPhone, we got to talk about Android a little bit. We might have different options associated with Android, and we're going to talk about some of those more in detail. But an example of an enhanced logical image with Android might be the downgrade of applications associated with the device to be able to get more information than you can with the traditional backup associated with Android. So those are little things you have to look for, and you really have to kind of go through and check your features of whatever tool you're using to say, what does that actually mean with this particular tool? Another type of image might include a file system image. And that's actually where we're going to see our logical data, and then we're going to also have access into our file system. So that is unique to particular tools that can do that with Apple devices. And it is also unique with tools that can do it to Android devices because it's different methodology for each one of them. So that's another thing we want to check. And the last one is really when you're looking at a lot of the bypasses, we always reference kind of a dump of that data. So, what we're really doing is we're doing a binary dump because a smartphone is an embedded system device, which means its primary functions are determined by the chip that is selected on the board that is running that smartphone. That's when we start talking directly to the chip to be able to bypass and gain access into the firmware OS of the device. And that's going to affect what our acquisition can be. The trick for any of the bypass dumps is, as many of you know, it is extremely specific to a particular device itself or a family of devices because they kind of work in families. So if I'm going to communicate directly to a single chip on a board, I should be able to also communicate to the exact same chip on a variety of different models of that same device. But you want to keep that in mind because there isn't a blanket statement when it comes to smartphones. It's probably one of the hardest reasons that it is to get quality images is because it is all done through unique research by each tool manufacturer. So you're going to get different results for each one. Unlike when we look at a computer image, I know I have a set disk size. I know I'm going to go from 0 to the nth of the disk every time. I don't have those same capabilities because every smartphone will change. It's high maintenance. That's how we'll think of it. So when I'm looking at my physical acquisitions and I'm really trying to make my tool selections of what I want to do, the secret sauce is really that Android side. And I say that because of my example. This is Apple is extremely structured. It has very similar results for each tool. Even as I do my validation or testing of different tools, I will see minor differences in my acquisitions between tool A and tool B that might be just associated with particular temp files that didn't come over in one image versus another. But overall, I'm getting very similar data from each one of them. But with Android, because I have multiple manufacturers I have to deal with, I have a large variety of chipsets to deal with, and I kind of get different flavors of the same firmware based on each implementation. I have a lot more problems in getting a good solid image because I'm going for that enhanced logical image. So couple questions you have to ask throughout your validation process. How are they actually doing this? Because your manufacturers are going to be like, this is our secret sauce. I'm not going to tell you what's in this secret sauce because it's what makes my tool special over another tool that might be over here. Then you need to ask questions like, well, how are you validating this? How do I know it is going to work with my particular devices? Go to the documentation associated with the different tools. It should be well documented what their technique is. It can't be entirely secret. There is no magic. I know I'm wrecking that, even on Valentine's Day, that there's no magic out there. But there's definitely no magic when it comes to doing your forensic acquisitions. So definitely keep that in mind that whatever feature set you're using, whether it's you're using a downgrade methodology, you might be using a chip dump methodology with an Android device, it should be well documented to understand what potential risk there is to the data on this particular device based on how it's communicating and passing the data back and forth, and then what should be my expectation of data once my acquisition is complete. All of that should be well documented within your tool. The other side of it is those unique approaches. So some of those might be rooting. I have been a proponent of rooting for my entire mobile forensics career that started back in 2001, however long this was. But I think rooting is an excellent methodology to be able to gain full access to the most data on an Android device. It's relatively safe, it's easy to follow, and it's also maintained by an entire community. So you're not waiting for a small number of companies that might exist in our specialized digital forensic space to do the research. You get to participate with a larger community base that really wants to just gain access into this environment to be able to enhance their use of the product, which means they do a lot of testing, they do a lot of checks in it, and you usually get a nice community growth associated with rooting. So I am a big fan of it for use within your forensic environment. You might also be doing downgrading associated with different apps. That's a great way to kind of put a hole through your file system that says, hey, I'm just going to do a hole and a handshake right now over into this app. Now, some of the different tools out there might be doing a downgrade through different methods, and you need to check their methodology for it. They might be installing an app on the actual forensic device, your suspect's device. If that's the case, then you really need to understand what that structure of the app, what its fingerprint is, and where does this immediately start allocating its data over to, because that's where you're going to have an override of your potential suspect information. So that's something you should have in your lab documentation before using that type of methodology. And then the last one, and we had this as well with iOS, so I'll just deal with it in the same area, but it's really accessing some of the unique private areas. So with both iOS 18 and Android 15, they decided to make app areas potentially private. And I really should do an air quote of private, because private to them and private to forensics are two different things. So you will get different results based on that. So when Apple decided to make their apps private and be able to hide them behind a potential lock or a pin or what it might be, that could stop your forensic tool from getting that information. You have to go through and double check, make sure that they're matching that feature set and that data is still acquired. Technically, what Apple is doing is it's really just doing a metadata flag change. So it's really just saying, hey, this is something that is apparent. I see this app on the phone and I want to hide this app over here. So maybe just don't have that shortcut out and visible to everyone. It wasn't a massive hide, it wasn't a push behind an encrypted wall, nothing like that. So a lot of your tools are able to respond to that very quickly. And of course, that shows a different intent by our potential suspect when they choose to hide over their different apps. Now, with Android, they did make it a lot more complex. They actually did build a small wall around it. And so a lot of your forensic tools might not be supporting it at this particular time where they're able to get into those private access areas associated with Android. Now, that's been out and released since I believe it was mid October. So it's only on our Pixels. We're not seeing it push out to our other devices yet, but that is something that I need to look with it or look for with my particular devices and make sure I'm paying attention to not only what my forensic tool can do, but what the trend is happening with the firmware itself. So I like to keep both it's going to sound very old school. I like to keep a binder of not only the firmware releases that happen with my smartphone operating systems or firmwares, but I also like to keep the information that coincides with my selected tools that I use within my forensic lab. And that's an important thing to kind of track between those two because it's affecting how your evidence is getting captured. And you need to know if it's going to capture all that data within that same time period of their release, or if you're going to have to go back and recapture because maybe you were missing a capability with your acquisition tool. So here's our big question. How do we pick what's right? There's a lot of choices out there, and I know you guys probably all expected me to just do a hard pitch about the forensic choices of paraben, but really I'm telling you how to make a good educated choice because a good tool will always come to the top as a good choice in the end. So how do you pick? Do you just Google, you ask around, you watch the marketing, you go to a trade show? Lots of options, right? So these are how I make my choices. So I make my choices based on the purpose of what my lab is. Do I need to bypass a lot of passwords? Will I be working with consent often? Are you focusing on specific data areas? Perhaps my lab is limited to only having communication areas that might be relevant to the corporation that I might be maintaining. Are you entitled to more data sources? So if you're law enforcement, are you able to get additional sources of information that might come from a CDR or from other cloud resources that I might not get on the private sector side? So it is going to shift a little bit between our public and our private sector side. Other questions you have, do you have an unlimited budget? I mean, is the sky the limit? Can you go out and you're like, I absolutely, when I'm looking for my smartphone tool, I can spend as much as I want to spend on a new car? Or do I need to be more budget conscious because I want to diversify what my tool sets are within my lab? So these are questions you're going to ask yourself. And then one, does that cost impact what your choices are? And that's really about diversifying your tool choices within your lab, because we never should have just one tool. This is my number one pet peeve out there. When I started learning the digital forensic world, when it was climbing out the primordial DOS stage of life, one of the first things was the rule about making the choice of two tools, because you really need to see the perspective of the data from two different environments, because we are an entire industry based on proprietary research. And that proprietary research means that my research as Amber is going to be different than Megan's research might be, or than Bob's research might be. And you have to keep that in mind because it's going to show you a different data result. So this is how I go through and take these types of questions and then turn them into a working model.
Hey,
So
Amber.
yeah,
Sorry to interrupt your train of thought, but we
go
had a
ahead.
couple of questions that
Yeah,
came
two.
in.
Gives me
So,
a chance to drink water too.
all right, the first one's related to kind of what you were talking about on that previous slide. How many
Mhm.
tools do you recommend utilizing for your forensic analysis, such as for work or business?
So, it really, a lot of it right now, I think, is built by budget, but you have to have a minimum of 2. So if you have a very small budget, then you're gonna pick a proprietary tool, and then you're probably gonna use an open source tool, because you know you can use that open source tool for free. But the other side of using an open source tool is that you're gonna have to do, more validation testing on it, because it doesn't go through a traditional commercial test plan as part of its process. But a minimum of 2. I like to keep 3 to 4 working tools in my lab if I can, but based on some of the price changes I've seen out there, I'm down to 3 to make it so it's actually cost effective.
All right, awesome. Thank you. And then the other question that we had says, seems like cost is a barrier into this field. What can someone do to get started in the field and gain experience?
I do believe cost is a barrier into the field as far as being able to outfit your own lab. I do think that there are options for people who are just getting started, and I am a big proponent of doing volunteer work for nonprofits. And I know you're all just went, "Oh, what do you mean?" And when you're really trying to get some experience under your belt, a lot of times, depending on the tool manufacturer, you might be able to approach them and say, "Hey, is there any way that you would grant me a discounted price to have your tool in my lab to do work for nonprofits for a period of time? And I can't afford your regular price," that kind of thing. Ask the questions. If you don't ask, it's always going to be the answer is no. So you might as well ask. It's not going to hurt you to ask. The other side of it is getting familiar with some of the open source tool community, because you're not having that overhead on it, but you're going to become really familiar with making a good test plan, which I think is valuable to you. The reason I brought up the nonprofit side is you want to get real world experience, even though I can make an amazing test scenario or a lab scenario that you could use in like my classroom environments, whatever it may be. It's not the same as when you're actually sitting in it and seeing the people behind their data. And so a lot of nonprofits out there, they do not have someone that has our perspective, our knowledge, because we are cyber adjacent. We're going to call it that. They're happy to have you come on and really kind of evaluate their overall environment, write a forensic response plan for them if they do have a problem. Or forensics is also a response when they transfer out volunteers or employees. All of that can give you some of that real world experience that you're not going to be able to simulate within training classes or on your own. And I have offered my services up to a variety of nonprofits, and they've all said yes. I haven't had a single one of them say no to me. I've maintained at any given time probably 4 different nonprofits. I'm really just making sure that they had a good security strategy, but also that they had a good forensic response strategy for things like a staff member leaving, or making sure that they don't share all their passwords on a piece of paper. Little things like that that you're stepping into with a new perspective for them. And then I say, can I work and look at some of your data as part of the process? Typically, there's a non disclosure also involved because you are volunteering for that organization, but go through that extra work to do it. If you need a general NDA, hit me an email. I'll send you a general NDA that allows you to go out and give people a strategic plan for doing this type of work. I'm now off my little nonprofit volunteer soapbox. Any other questions?
Thanks, Amber. That's all the questions we have for the moment.
Thank you. All right, so let's go to my other graphic. So this is what a tiered tool lab design looks like. And obviously I have taken out names of tools, everything else, but I wanted to give you kind of a perspective of how to look at it. And I say that because what I do is I create a large spreadsheet, and I do love spreadsheets. Sorry, you're going to have to suck it up through the spreadsheet part. But I create a very large spreadsheet that goes through and really breaks down all the feature sets associated with the tools I'm making a decision for acquisition. When I go through and do that, then as I evaluate them, hopefully I can get a trial license associated with it. I see how that's going to work within my workflow associated with those last questions. Who am I delivering an end acquisition tool, an end acquisition file to? Because otherwise, I could overspend. If I'm not going to be in a position where I have to do a ton of unlocking, then I shouldn't spend my money on a tool that their number one feature is unlocking, because I'm going to spend more money on something that isn't going to give me a product that is going to help me. So that's why you go through kind of this breakdown of the different tools out there. And I apologize, my chart isn't complete there. Hide that. One of the biggest things that I think we discount within our space in general is really focusing on some of those unique analytic steps. Because if you can't find the data, it doesn't matter absolutely how you got it acquired. It's like good on you, but you can't find it. We'll talk about analytics within our next series in this 3-part series, but really it's about the analysis of that data that matters more than anything else. So after we kind of looked through and evaluated these different features, we would make our choices within them. This is an example of my spreadsheet. So it is a massive spreadsheet. I've redacted all the information out of it, but I want you to see that there isn't as massive of a difference in features when you really start breaking it down between all the different tools. And I think that's really the surprise for a lot of people. You have a huge amount of venture capital that has come into the digital forensic space. And so a lot of that money goes into really marketing up companies to be the prettiest, sparkliest, most amazing thing on the planet. They are trying to be the Pegasus unicorn we have always wanted and hoped for. But the fact is, there is no Pegasus unicorn out there, because no matter what happens, it still is going to be an investigator as an individual that is really making the difference in that data depth. So this is just an example for you of the spreadsheet. It keeps going on and on. I try to keep a good pulse of what is happening within this. And I have a similar spreadsheet as well. I know I'm talking specifically about smartphones, but I have a similar spreadsheet that also applies to computer related data and Mac data and Linux data and all of those, so that I can really keep on top of what is happening within the space. And do I need to make different tool shifts? I'm not a fan of having locked down release notes from different tool manufacturers. I feel like we should all be transparent because we are an industry together. But I know that's happening more and more. So that should be something as well that you have to look at within your tool decision choices. I do believe that transparency is crazy important, because you have to go back to that same company if you ever need special support for a court case. And if they weren't transparent with you in the first place, they're probably not going to be when you need them the most. The other thing we watch, I mentioned my firmware shifts. Yes, I like binders. Yes, I like to print them off. But make sure you're paying attention to how your tools are quickly supporting your latest firmwares with it. Are they putting out announcements when we have sub-firmware versions released? Do they retest and share that information with their user base to say, hey, by the way, when it was 1.3 that came out with iOS, it was checked, it was validated. Because yes, I know we're on Valentine's Day, but you are when you choose to use their type of technology. So you need to make sure that they're actually a good part of the relationship, that they're communicating with you. They track some of those unique features that come out. Like I mentioned, the lockdown app section that we got out of this last firmware release. What is their status on that? How are they supporting it? Putting the research into it. Make sure that's happening, because that's part of what you need out of them in your tool relationship. And the last part is, of course, our renewals and support. So Pet peeve of the world is I do hate it when I can't call a real person. So that is my pet peeve. I am so speaking out as a Gen Xer in that aspect, but sometimes I do need to talk to someone on a phone, and I don't want to talk to someone who has no idea what I'm talking about. I don't want to talk to a call service. I want to talk to a real person. That is a pet peeve for me when picking tool choices. The other choice is I need to watch for my overhead as my business and my consulting would continue on year to year, that I don't have such an inflated overhead that I can't end up making any money. So that's on the private sector side. On the public sector side, that still is something that's valuable to you because that allows you to determine, are you going to be able to have a continued budget that is reasonable and fair for you to maintain? So keep those in mind. And then the last one is you have to have a provision for both sides. And yes, I have found very funny light switch, and I might have to buy that light switch because it cracked me up with the light side and the dark side. At the end of the day, all of your tools are doing one simple thing. They're really doing a whole lot of math. When they do this math, it is the same math they would do for you versus doing it for the other side of the case. It doesn't matter if you're private sector or you're public sector, there's always two sides to the case that you're working on. And with that, you have to make sure that you do a fair provision with your tool for both sides. Either you have an easy way for both sides to be able to review the data that you've produced, or that you can make a generic output that is open to other tools. Whatever it may be, make sure that you have a provision that does work for both sides of that case, because if you don't, you are really just wrecking the entire principle of what our industry is about, and making sure we have a digital justice that is happening. So let's talk about our second area. Let's talk about cloud, just a tiny bit. So with our cloud approach, our tool, when we go through and we pick something for a smartphone acquisition, it naturally is touching the cloud. It's impossible for it not to, because our devices we have here are always in touch with the cloud as well. So we're going to see some of that data spill occur between the two devices. We need to make sure that our tool and our technology not only has a methodology for how it is going to approach that data that came from our acquisition source, but we also have to make sure we can include that as part of our overall workflow. Is it part of a cost-effective solution we can implement? And is it actually good at pulling this information? Because if it doesn't do the provisions you need for the cloud correctly, it's going to end up blacklisting you, and you're not going to be able to pull data, period. So we don't want to see those types of things happen. So first off, I have to say this tiny little thing. I'm not a lawyer. I do not play a lawyer on TV. I'm simply giving you feedback and from experience in the field. Your first rule of thumb for cloud, because we haven't had any precedented cases about it, is you should talk to the lawyers involved or talk to what is provisioned within your case examination. As part of my default cases now, I have every single person that signs a letter of engagement with our private consulting side of things. They also sign a consent to be able to capture that cloud information, because I typically want to do all of my capture and my acquisition at the same time, because I don't want to have a massive shift in my data that said I got my phone on Monday and I didn't get the cloud data until Friday. I kind of want to keep my capture within that same time frame. So that's one of the reasons that I automatically give people a consent document. Once we process their device, we immediately start looking for associated cloud keys to process that data. So make sure, what do you do if you get consent? Are you going to do like I do, where I immediately process those cloud keys so I have all of my acquisitions within that same time period? Do you have a right to the keys if they were on the device itself? Make sure you're limiting your right to the keys on the device, because it can always be mixed parties. So if I let my husband use my phone, he could a cloud storage he has, it drops his keys on my phone. That is not part of my original scope, so keep that in mind. And if the account is corporate, where are the rules and rights associated with it? So go back, talk to that lawyer. Typically, corporate data is corporate data, so it doesn't belong to that individual. So a good example for you of some of those great cloud keys out there, I use an iPhone as my example. Knowing that I'm going with my enhanced logical acquisition of this device, I'm immediately going to capture up those cloud keys. I'm going to see any of the known credentials that they have. I'm going to see potential recovered credentials that would have happened associated with the keychain data. And then I also have the option where I can also work cloud data by working directly with my potential suspect or even my potential client in this case. I think a lot of people are caught up in a marketing bundle of like Sparkle that says, hey, you only can get this information if you're going to buy X level of a tool. This is something that should be at our default level of expectation of data associated with our tools. So you just have to make sure that you know how the tool is collecting this information and then offering it back up to you to authorize into a cloud environment. So this is our reasonable expectation of data associated with cloud data. We should almost always see profile details. We'll see images, messages, contacts, potential timelines of the information, followers, storage. All of those are things that we should see in every cloud acquisition we get based on what the app is that generated, of course, that cloud data. But if you don't have a reasonable expectation of data, when you go to validate or check or verify what your tool is functioning, you're not going to know if it's not functioning properly. So make sure you understand that before we're going through that entire acquisition and tool selection stage of our process. Then we have to set up our lab for cloud. This is something that has really shifted, especially the more that cloud has grown out of our environment as far as more data is going that way. Of course, I bring up consent again. But we have multiple ways we can get the credentials. Of course, we can have our suspect grant us credentials as well, which is great. They could write them down. They could do whatever. I have that as part of the consent form where they can actually write their credentials as part of it. But when I go back to my lab, one of the things I have to do that is a shift in how my lab works is I had to set up either a VPN or a proxy to make sure that all the times that we're querying to the cloud that we're not going to end up getting blacklisted by a group like Meta, who has a large amount of cloud storage associated with it, that all of a sudden they're just not going to knock my IP address out, and then I'm stuck having problems with my lab doing my production. So do make sure you actually have that built into your budgets. I think that having a good VPN or having a good proxy server is something that you have to budget for. It's not something that you're like, hey, let me just go find the easiest, freest tool out there and let me implement this and hope it's going to work, because it is one of your primary collection pieces of evidence. Remember, we talked device, we're talking cloud, and our last one we're going to talk about is compliance. So spend a little bit of money. It's not crazy money. It's not super expensive, but make sure you've implemented something that is going to do a good job as that VPN or proxy for you. So here are some examples for you of ease of use versus free versus paid, those different things, just so you could have it. You could also screen capture it if you needed to. But the big thing is make sure that it is protecting your IP address the way that it needs to for you to be able to do continual cloud collections. Love a good chart. So now I'm going to have Kevin do a different methodology. And I say that because we did, I don't remember, I think it was at least a year ago, we implemented the ability to capture data live. And the reason is we've had more and more cases where we have someone that's out in the field and they're like, here, let me just share this information here. Or we do a lot of stalking cases. They're like, I know they're following me. I know they're doing this. It's like, here, instead of me waiting until I can get access to your phone or do this, let's collect some of the primary ways that I know people are typically watching someone. And so we'll go in and we'll do a live capture associated with it. So Kevin, I think you can just take over the share on the bottom. Let's see. Kevin, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Go ahead and take over the share. Come back here. Go ahead.
Okay. So when we want to capture live cloud data, oh, hey, I love that when it happens.
I was like, reshare your screen, Kevin. Sorry, I hit a button.
Okay, when we're talking about cloud and bringing cloud in, we have two different methodologies that we can actually do this from. In most cases, like Amber was saying, we can capture those cloud keys directly from different kinds of sources, whether you're Android, iPhone being, an encrypted backup file, having access to those passwords, those keychain data, and those cloud token keys. So E3 would allow us to either bring in the authentication data file, or we can bring it in via a cloud account. So when we talk about this, we're talking about authentication data files. So this can be actually pulled directly from an iOS device or an Android device that has been rooted, or we can add these accounts in manually. So manually adding them in, we can have things like Amazon, Discord, Dropbox, Facebook Messenger, all your Google services, your iCloud backup, your iCloud sync data, Instagram, Slack, and so on. If you're going to do it via the authentication data file, you want to make sure that you either have an encrypted iOS backup or root level access on an Android device. And in this instance, we're working with Google Pixel 7. It's running Android 15, and it has been rooted. So you want to go directly to the authentication data file. I might have to resync this. Yeah, that's what I thought. Give me 2 seconds here, Amber.
No worries. It's actually sharing the other screen. So one of the things to keep in mind, so as Kevin pulls in his authentication data file, that's where you're going to see credentials from multiple accounts. One of the things when you're doing a cloud collection, and we might not end up getting to it because I didn't know how long this was going to be as a presentation. I want to make sure I hit that last part, is when you really capture cloud, the biggest aspect is you've got to decide how much are you actually going to do in your privy or in your capture, because that capture can represent an entire existence of someone. So if you're capturing my Facebook, my Instagram, whatever it may be, it's going to be since the date and time I started it. So while Kevin does that, I'm actually going to pop back into my slides real quick. You're going to get that lovely little like infinity thing for a moment.
My drive disconnected.
No worries. We'll come back to it. So let's talk about beyond that collection of the cloud side of it. We'll go back to that one. I'm just watching what the time is. So we'll do that demonstration at the very end. Is beyond that scope of what sections of the cloud I want to get, the larger scope really comes with that compliance data. So as I go to that last data source, I'm working with someone collaboratively or cooperatively, either choice, it doesn't matter. When you do that, you're going to still have those credentials for the account. You're going to need access to that data. Typically, you're going to log in, request the compliance archive, and then you wait for that delivery. The best part about compliance data that I like on the private sector side is I don't have the ability to go to Meta or to Google or to TikTok or whoever it may be and say, hey, you need to give me all of this data. They're going to be like, go pound sand, woman. We do not want to talk to you. I don't have that same law enforcement privy with it. So this allows me to almost get beyond that scope that happens with the subpoena request so I can then capture the same information. If on the private sector side, like I am, I'm working collaboratively with a client. So the more data I have to review for them, the better it's going to be for me to find what is the problem associated with the investigation. We add a ton of different compliance data with our tool, and actually in the free version as well, we add a lot of that just for free users, because I know someone had asked, how do I afford these proprietary tools? Remember, a lot of tools will have a free version. We have a free version that we put out for you that has limited options for you, but it even gives you options to collect from the cloud. So understand what the features are, of course, and do that. But there is a second side of this that goes into my investigation, which is that OSINT side of it. I believe OSINT and digital forensics work hand in hand together. So I like to do this with my client to make sure that they're understanding what they're collecting. If I were law enforcement, I could do the exact same thing or same process with my potential suspect, log in with them. You're immediately going to see a lot of information about them. And I'm even using myself as an example here. So this is my Facebook profile. I logged into it, and immediately I see some important information here that tells me that my scope of my investigation might be larger than what I was initially told it was. Because I can see we have access Facebook Messenger, that I was active in Facebook Messenger. I see I have access here to the Meta Business Suite, which means I have business profiles associated with my individual profile. That's how you make a business profile in the Facebook Meta universe, is you have to start a personal profile first. I also see I have it associated with a Meta Quest account, which means that I've got an Oculus device associated with me, and I also have Ray-Ban smart Meta glasses associated with me, because my Facebook profile, before I added those additional IoT items, did not have those noted in there. So I immediately see something where my potential person, and remember, I call everyone a suspect, so even the people I do consulting work for, they're still a suspect. Someone's suspected of something. So they're not telling me that they have 2 other large IoT sources associated with them, but just by doing a compliance request, I can see that information is available. After I go in there, of course, I hit settings and privacy and see the information associated with it, go into the privacy center. I can see all the common privacy center settings with my suspect. This is a lot of tongue twisters here. When I do that, that is also going to tell me, so if I'm working a stalking case, this is telling me how my suspect is potentially existing within this platform. So that is also telling me potentially where their attacker might be coming from. So that's one of the reasons I like to do that with them. As I continue to go through it, I then get to see what their account profiles are. So I'm not limited to what they said. Oh, hey, I only have a Facebook. I'm like, oh, it says you have an Instagram. Did it potentially happen with Instagram? Oh, it looks like you have an Oculus device as well. And when my suspect says, I have no idea what that thing is, then I know that's a potential vector that I might be needing in my investigation. After that, I can do my request. I could choose how much my information I want to download associated with it. And then it says, hey, what do you want to do with this? What accounts do you want to capture it from? I've redacted. And then, of course, how much information do you want to get? And that's a tough one. I always ask my clients that they get all of it, and then I filter it in my examination or my analytics process, because I would rather start with the most possible data than the least amount of data. So keep that in mind. After it gets collected, by the way, this collection, because I did do this before, it took 48 hours to produce. So it was fairly fast. Then one of the things that I like about this, and this is that OSINT site as well, you immediately have access to previous activities. The reason this is valuable to me with some of my investigations is if someone was potentially capturing this information out of them because they had access to their credentials, then I know this might be my vector of attack for my potential suspect, because their data was requested to be downloaded 2 other prior times to the one that I'm requesting them to do as part of my investigation. There's now new information, though, associated with some of this compliance data. So I just recently taught a class, and one of my students hadn't seen the movie Minority Report. I recommend everyone watch that, because the whole idea of this concept was, of course, that they're getting advertised to for each individual uniquely based on what they might be interested in. And although that one was all done through augmented reality, we're really living that reality through our smartphones ourselves, because if your phones have been sitting on your desks or whatever while you've been in this webinar and your speakers have been on, it's going to change what you're going to see in your profiles as you start using your phone later on. We now see that Meta is recording that information that potentially is happening through a share through third parties, and it's available to us in our compliance data section. And this wasn't available to us 3 months ago. It shows you how that activity information was not only used, but if it was secured and shared with others. So here's an example for you, and I redacted some of this from there because I did say I used my activity data. Sorry. So what I can see is I can see how many times those individual pieces of data associated with my Meta profile were then shared over to these other data sources, and it's quite a bit. So sorry. So it might lead you down the path of, I'm so sorry. Oh, so sorry. Of where your data is going. Here's an example here with TikTok. I'm totally going to lose my voice. I'm so sorry. This is what happens when you're in the desert and you're like, oh, I have dry throat. All right, so within my compliance data and my shared data that happened between the two, I have 969 interactions between my two different data sources. I did not have access to this from my smartphone. I don't get it from my cookies. I don't get it from any of those other data sources. So this is why this information is so valuable to you. And like I said, it only took 2 days for it to produce from all of these different data sources. Once that data source comes in, I can simply pick it and I can go through and choose the analytics of it. And I want to leave this screenshot up for just a minute because I want you guys to think of your smartphone investigations and how little you saw associated with some of the information it collects, but how much information there is potentially when you get through all 3 of the potential data sources for it. I totally need to pause for this question thing because I'm going to cough my head off. Hang on one second. Let me pop over here for a second and give you guys a chance to ask questions while I cough and turn my camera off so I can do so.
Alrighty, thanks, Amber. Let me pop my camera on real quick while you're getting your water break in. I can start reading off questions for you, Amber, if that's helpful. We got a lot coming in
Yes,
now.
please. Go ahead. Sorry.
Alrighty, so top question. Everything is usually based on the order of volatile data. However, with the new features of iPhone security with only a 72-hour time frame, is that even feasible to obtain possession in time?
I think it is feasible to obtain possession in time because I realize I'm totally processing with FIFO, which is first in, first out. Now, remember with that and transit and everything else, there are ways that you can create good remote options that aren't going to be like, hey, now I just need to spend another 50 grand doing remote options. There are affordable ways for you to have a secure remote connection somewhere that is still forensically sound, whether it's having them set up a secondary workstation. I love the tool Rust Desk. It's like, oh, it's a rusty pipe or whatever, but it's Rust Desk because you can create a private forensic server to be able to do remote deployments with. And you can have them generate the data so you know you've got a copy of something, you've got some type of image. So if you do have a window where you're losing that opportunity, you still have something. But you do have to shift and pivot. It's not where we can just do the exact same thing every day forever. So I do like that for remote acquisition. Sometimes your tool licensing will allow you to deploy a remote agent, have someone sit there on the other side, trust the device, allow it to process through, and then you monitor it remotely in your lab until you get it. That and processing, we didn't end up with time for it with Kevin, but doing a live collection with some of the key pieces of social media data, for example, those are also an opportunity in that FIFO principle.
All right, thanks, Amber. Next question we have is, how do you capture the cloud data from a locked phone that's not rooted?
So that means you're just limiting what your cloud data sources are. So you're not going to be able to get known credentials off the device if you don't have access to root or you don't have access to that keychain data. So you're going to go to your suspect and either capture the data there, or you could pull it off of cookies off of another device. So you might be able to pull it off of their desktop. Just because a good example is I log into WhatsApp on my desktop, I log onto it on my phone. My credentials are in both of those places just by the nature of how the different machines work. So don't, just because we're focusing on smartphones, don't forget that your smartphone apps and potentially all of their credentials are also going to touch another data source back to the computer itself. And yes, I did not cough too much, but just so you know, yes, I did have to tear up because I have a very dry throat. Like I said, I'm in the desert. It's dry.
It happens.
It does.
Do you have a couple more questions?
Mhm.
So next up, are there any trainings or certifications that will help in order to get into the digital forensics world?
I'd say the best one to kind of give you your foundation is actually with IASIS. IASIS is a nonprofit, so they're not driven by a vendor standard, anything like that. There is vendor impact in IASIS, but they're not typically driven by that. I think they are going to give you the best foundational information in digital forensics to get started. I think their B-Skers class is kind of the generic cert, so to speak. And it is hard. It's a lot of work. It's 2 weeks down in Orlando if you want to do it live at their conference. So it is a commitment into the space. I do believe they offer some virtual on-demand options as well. But look up, I think it's iasis.org. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's
Yeah.
correct.
So iacis.org, they're a great nonprofit to work for that. For other options, there are a lot of private sector options out there that offer training. You don't have to spend a gazillion dollars to be able to get great training. So don't discount something just because it has maybe a smaller price tag. Look at what the content is, review the outline, make sure it matches up with what you need to do. And a lot of different people in the field offer opportunities to get their certifications at no cost when they initially launch them. Grab those up. The more that you can do, the more training you can do, the better it is.
Already, I just realized I put the wrong IASIS link. It's iasis.com. So I'll put that in the chat. But we do.
Sorry.
No,
I know.
I'm the one
trying to remember, and there are two different organizations. Yeah, I'm like, oh crap, I don't
Yeah.
remember their domain.
But the one that Amber was talking about is iasis.com. Additional questions. Regarding cloud collection, I continuously received an error when entering user credentials and attempted to access the client's cloud. I'm not really sure.
That's probably, I mean, if you aren't running a VPN while you're doing it, you're probably ending up getting blacklisted. That is happening more and more often, and that can be a problem with it. The other problem that you have to face is you've got to look at the two-factor authentication that might potentially be set up with different cloud collections. A lot of times you have the two-factor device, but you have isolated it off of the network. So if you find that a cloud collection has failed because of two-factor, typically you'll be prompted, depending on your tool, that says that is why it is failing. You might have to add to your case notes that said, I allowed this device access in order to authenticate the 2FA. And then after the 2FA was authenticated, I then again isolated it from the network so I could continue to do the rest of my cloud acquisition. There's nothing wrong with that methodology, but if you don't take the proper notes to say that's what you did in your process of your workflow, then you're making a mistake because you're not documenting it. So that's the big thing you have to do.
Alrighty, and the last question we have on here, where can I find resources to get started in the field in terms of how to get started, processes, and technology?
There's two ways to look at getting started. So there's learning the actual principles of the field, the science side of the field, all of that. That's what I recommend IASIS for. The other side of it is, hey, I want to enhance my skills, learn how to start my own practice associated with it. That's a webinar for another day. I hate to say it that way, but it's a little bit larger scale of a webinar because you've got to talk about, what do I need to do in my business? How do I know this is actually going to be successful? And you really have to take kind of a business perspective on digital forensic practices because they're not going to sell everywhere. So you might not be able to run a practice everywhere. So you have to keep that in mind. It's an excellent suggestion. If you want to clarify, you're welcome to email me and ask for very direct questions on that. It's just amber@parabon.com. I know I quit sharing my screen when I started coughing.
That's fine. We did have one last question come in, and it's a very relevant. Do you have a source for industry standards concerning mobile device seizure and processing?
So NIST is a great source for how to validate a tool.
Mhm.
I don't believe that they really go into what the proper workflow is associated with it. A lot of times you're going to get that training from organizations like IASIS. They have mobile classes as well. I know that's something that I include in my training. I know there are other training organizations that do it as well. I do believe that there's also a couple ebooks that might be in Cyber Social Hub that go through and kind of outline what the proper workflows are to really get started with processing smartphones.
All right, cool.
Can I add to that, Amber?
Mm-hmm.
Some people also like to have a really strong SOP in place.
Yeah. So, and I think we are a community. I think that's an important thing to remember. So a lot of times we're happy to share it. Like I share my consent document with people all the time that maybe didn't have that set up before. It's pretty generic, so it's not like it really matters what state or country you're using it in, but it gives you kind of a format to work off of. And I think that's one of the values of it as a community. So good SOP, good workflow, all of that.
Alrighty. That is it for questions.
Okay. Look at our timing.
Look at our
We're like
timing.
rock stars of timing right now. And I'm not coughing anymore. So
Did you have anything else to wrap up before we take everybody back out to the floor?
no, I think everyone take your opportunity to make sure when you look to add an acquisition component to your smartphone investigations that you look at an entire market perspective. Don't get caught up with just marketing jargon. Take the time to actually spreadsheet it out, look at the features you actually need and use that to make your decision, but always make sure that you're implementing more than one tool in that decision. There is a huge difference between a tool A and a tool B and what data they actually produce. So you want to watch for that.
Thank you, Amber. As Amber was talking about, we're looking at different ways of bringing in cloud information into to be able to capture that data. So a couple of different ways that we can do that is we can go directly to our authentication data and export that information from the authentication data file and bring it into the cloud import. But we're going to do a live cloud capture. So bring up the cloud import wizard and we're going to add account. In this example, we're going to do a Facebook Messenger. You're going to enter in the credentials. And you click authenticate. We can see that was successful and we're going to click continue. We can do a date range and just grab specific date areas, or we can bring down all the information associated to the account. We're just going to click import data. You can see that was successful. We're going to click the finish button. E3 will add that information to our case file. And we can expand those nodes open and take a look at the data that we just brought down. So we have our investigative information, general profile information, and investigative details.